very much for joining us for this panel. My name is Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna. I'm a policy counsel with the Future of Privacy Forum. Today's panel that we organized is about privacy engineering and whether privacy engineering can be a lingua franca or a common language, if you want, between the European and American privacy worlds. As you know, we always talk about differences between these two systems of protecting privacy. At one point, we thought about why not finding common threads that we can use to build a stronger dialogue. I'm going to briefly introduce the panel, and then I will give the floor to Mr. Achim Klabunde here. Achim Klabunde is our chair today. He's the head of the IT policy department of the European Data Protection Supervisor and the coordinator of IPEN, the Internet Privacy Engineering Network. Then we have Naomi Lefkovitz, who is Senior Privacy Policy Advisor in the Information Technology Lab at NIST in the US, National Institute of Standards and Technology, under the Department of Commerce. We have also Carmela Troncoso here. She is an assistant professor at EPFL in Switzerland. She has a PhD in engineering with an awarded thesis on design and analysis methods for privacy technologies. Right next to Carmela, we have Ari Waldman, an associate professor of law and it sounded like a champagne.
No, well, I don't normally get that kind of introduction. Let's just stop. I mean,
yes, that was all. Ari is a director of the Innovation Center for Law and Technology at the New York University Law School. And he very recently won an award for his paper, Designing Without Privacy. So that's a bit intriguing. We'll find out more about that. Right next to Ari, there's Simon Hania. He is the Vice President of Privacy and Security at Tomtom in the Netherlands. There we have, right next to Simon, we have Jeff Jonas, who is the founder and CEO of Sensing. He's a very, very experienced privacy engineering. Achim, I give the floor to you to set up the framework of the discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you to FBF for inviting me to chair this panel. The title is EU-US Privacy Engineering as a Lingua Franca for Transatlantic Privacy, which is like with even using Latin, maybe indicating that we are dealing with a challenging subject. Well, let me explain a bit how we got there. Gabriela already mentioned IPEN, the Internet Privacy Engineering Network. I'm happy to welcome some of its long-standing participants in the room. We started setting up 4.5 years ago. That was in the second half of 2013. And one trigger was that at the time it became very obvious that much of the technology that we use on the internet was doing anything but preventing tracking and surveillance, but was rather like supporting, as Bruce Schneier says in more recent statements, surveillance is a business model of the internet. That was very obvious. And one event which triggered our policy activities in particular was the meeting of the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, so the actual engineers who design the internet protocols in Vancouver, where they agreed on a kind of resolution which said massive tracking should be treated as a threat to the integrity of the network, and we as the engineers should do something about it. And we saw that as an invitation to get in contact with this crowd and try to make sure that when they talk about privacy, they understand the right thing of privacy, because not every technical interpretation of privacy and data protection comes to the same conclusion as what we expect from the fundamental rights and legal side. So we made a few efforts. We went to the IETF meeting, went to other conferences of designers like FOSDEM, Case Communications Congress, and at the end we found that we thought we had enough weight and had the first constituent meeting of the IPEN Internet Privacy Engineering Network in Berlin in September 2014. And since then we have kept this running as an initiative to take stock of what's there on privacy engineering in theory and practice, in research, in business, and to keep this going. A couple of years ago, the game changed considerably, and that was when the agreement on the GDPR was made, the General Data Protection Regulation for Europe. Suddenly, privacy engineering was no longer a good idea, but it has become a legal obligation. In 4 months from now, everybody will, 4 months from tomorrow, every provider of services will have to take it into account. And as probably doesn't need to be said at this conference at all, is that the GDPR is a European law, but it has definitely global impact. So I had the opportunity to visit a few events in the United States last year, and I have already said it at other conferences. I'm deeply impressed by the amounts being invested by companies in GDPR compliance. Maybe not everything in engineering, unfortunately, much in legal fees, but also there's a serious effort on the engineering side. And as we had many contacts with Gabriela's help and other colleagues with the Future of Privacy Forum, an organization which looks at the technical elements of privacy, among other things, we entered into a discussion to see, well, does everybody know what they have to do to comply with the state-of-the-art measures to implement safeguards for data protection and privacy principles in their products and services? And, well, that's a discussion which still needs to be continued. And for that end, we organized an event in November in Leuven, in the Catholic University of Leuven, which is one of the very good places for that because they have a privacy engineering program ongoing for many years, and Camilla is one of those who make it happen. And with colleagues from also including Carnegie Mellon University in the US, which was, to my knowledge, the first university ever which offered a privacy engineering master program. I'm lucky to say that that has changed since I looked, because I checked all the universities which I have had teaching or learning experiences, and their computer science programs now all have a privacy or data protection element in the curriculum. So we kind of following up today on the discussion that we had in Leuven, where we looked at what is the state of the art, where are the gaps in technology, where do we have to trigger more initiatives in business and research. And let me just give credit to my neighbor. We were glad that Naomi could join us in Leuven as well. Naomi and I had the first discussion about her initiative back in 2015 in Luxembourg on the 6th of October 2015, which is a date which is kind of a milestone in privacy history, because in the same city on that same day the European Court of Justice proclaimed its judgment in the Schrems case, which removed the safe harbor. So, and we saw the outcome of the NIST initiatives on privacy engineering in the last year, with the main document, the internal report, and I must say we were quite impressed how far this went into making privacy engineering a really defined and developed engineering process. And yeah, I think I leave there by way of introduction. Thank you, Gabriela.
Thank you very much, Achim. I'll just make a brief comment to start. This morning we had a very interesting panel on location tracking, physical tracking, and at one point or another, the panelists all went to the idea that, you know, all the brilliant minds that come up with this very complex methods to track your Wi-Fi signals, your MAC addresses, using beacons and so on, should also, or perhaps could also find the technical solutions to provide safeguards and to protect privacy. So more and more, privacy engineering is looked at as the best solution to the massive use of personal data. But the main question right now is whether privacy engineering can be a common language between Europe and the US. I invite the panelists to make their initial statements, and afterwards we will engage in discussions. So, Naomi, what do you think?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. So usually when you have a common language, you have definitions that you can understand. And I think that certainly privacy engineering as an evolving field or discipline, there isn't actually a universal definition. So I do think that's contributing to some communication difficulties. But at NIST, we have a working definition of privacy engineering as a specialty discipline of systems engineering that centers on removing conditions that can create problems for people when systems process their information or interact with them. And so I think a definition like this can help bridge our sort of two cultures for a couple of reasons. So first, by situating privacy engineering within the discipline of systems engineering, which is actually already well developed and even has international standards, we aren't trying to create new processes for organizations, but rather we are providing a privacy perspective or outcome within existing system engineering processes. Second, a privacy outcome and a risk model for system design is key. So this is why our definition focuses on minimizing problems that people can experience from information processing or interacting with the system. And just to be clear, we view the range of problems as non-limited. So, you know, embarrassment, discomfort, discrimination, loss of self-determination, economic loss, physical harm, so on. As long as they are sort of definable problems, any problem can be analyzed. So this really, though, helps system designers understand at a more granular level what the privacy concerns are. So, you know, principles are important considerations, but it's hard for engineers to understand how to implement them without a frame of reference. So, for example, take the data minimization principle. If you tell engineers, you know, just minimize data to what's, you know, appropriate and relevant and necessary, they'll say, everything's appropriate and relevant and necessary. And so they really need a way to analyze that, against risks in the system. And so when you say, well, processing this set of information in this way can create problems for individuals, then they can begin to say, oh, how much do I need that information? And, and then they can begin to think about what minimization means in that context. So short answer, I do think that privacy engineering is our best hope of bridging the way we manage privacy in our different environments. Because at the end of the day, we are all concerned about the impacts of data processing on people and how to best mitigate adverse outcomes while maximizing the benefits. So.
Thank you very much. Carmela, how do you see things from Europe? From Switzerland, neutral place.
Yeah, I'm new in Switzerland, so I'm not going to speak much about them. So I'm actually I'm a computer scientist, and I have always worked, for the last 10 years, I have worked on the design of privacy technologies. And for me, in my background and in the people in my community, we have always thought about this privacy engineering tools, or the privacy technologies that we build, as a tool to enable privacy as a human right. So on that sense, I think that privacy engineering can be a perfect bridge between America and Europe, because it's tackling a human right that is universal. So the question here is, well, what is privacy engineering and how do we do it? as Naomi says, we need a common definition. She said we need to minimize risk. In our work, we have also, or if you look at the literature and privacy technologies from a computer science point of view, the other thing we do is not only minimize risk, but also try to minimize the trust that we need to put on other entities in order to preserve our privacy. And that's the golden rule to design privacy technologies and to do privacy engineering. For us, small advertising, if you want to know more about this, I will be speaking about it at 3:30 in Area 42, Petit Hall. Advertising gone. So indeed, nowadays, like in the last years, we have seen greatest advances in privacy-enhancing technologies, in the breadth of operations that the technologies can do, in how efficient they have become. So we're actually ready to be this help that Naomi says that people need. Like the technology is there. And the gaps that exist, and we talk a lot about this in Leuven like a couple of months ago, are gaps that can be only solved, in my opinion, once we start to put this in practice, and technologies like us that design the tools are put face to face with the engineers that need to use them, and they tell us what is this last step that need to be done. Without this dialogue, we cannot really make it happen. And also the other thing is that it's not only a question of having the technology ready, it's also a question of incentives. And incentives can, on the one hand, come from the regulatory bodies as Achim said, like data protection regulation mandating privacy engineering, privacy in products, but also from a social perspective. And in this sense, I think there is a big need for a raise awareness for users that there is other way of actually doing technology that is not about collecting the data and use it again and again and again, but we can do it in a very different way so that they can start demanding this from companies.
Thank you very much for this point. Ari, tell us a bit more about designing without privacy, and I know you've spent a lot of time talking to privacy engineers and how they do things in practice.
Right. So thanks for having me on this panel. I think it's important to add to any conversation about privacy engineering is the fact that privacy engineers, like any other engineers, are people too. I am in the middle of a large ethnographic project where I have, over the last year or so, year and a half, I've been interviewing engineers, designers at mostly high technology companies, but they're all different types of technologies, from sharing economy companies, large technology companies in Silicon Valley and San Francisco in the United States, to New York, financial services companies, all different kinds of technology companies. And if you want, whether we're talking privacy by design, whether we're talking about privacy engineering, what is mostly missing from the conversation, what we have, we talk about law, we talk about CPOs, we talk about the technology, but when you ask real people to do real things with real technologies, what they do is going to be influenced by who they are, where they come from, where they're situated, the influences that come from their education, or the influences that come from their embodied experiences at a particular company. So I'm a law professor, but I'm a sociologist as well. And what I have learned from these interviews, and of course, ethnography is not meant to suggest that every single engineer thinks this way, or every single company has particular privacy by design problems. But what I've learned is there is a narrative or a feeling among engineers, whether they are privacy engineers or other types of designers, that it's difficult. It's not everything that we want, or not everything that the GDPR wants, can be coded, and that there are influences that affect the ability of privacy by design mandates from trickling down from a CPO or from a law all the way down to the ground, which translates into technology products. the inability of engineers, or sometimes the unwillingness, or the lack of a language for engineers to understand what we necessarily mean by privacy by design, has resulted in many instances engineers designing either not for a diversity of users, not considering users in design, not considering privacy, or maximizing other priorities that are incompatible, for example, with privacy. So the fact that, so I would add to answer the question, and then I'd like to engage in a larger discussion about this. To answer the question, can privacy engineering be a common language for Europe and the United States, or for all of us, and how can it advance protecting privacy? Well, again, only if the engineers who are designing the products that we use every day are on board as well. Just because there are a group of privacy engineers that are cool with it and on board doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate into the products that we use, because there are all these other barriers to getting privacy integrated into design.
Thank you very much, and perhaps we could talk a bit more about those barriers in the next round. Simon, what's your opinion about this common language?
Yeah,
or
thanks,
not?
Gabriela. And I want to build a bit on what Ari just said. Indeed, engineering is an activity conducted by human beings. And human beings have backgrounds, incentives, and the key question to make privacy engineering work is to also find out what makes them tick. Because engineers don't grow on trees. Resources are scarce, it's fluid, and engineers actually live to solve problems. They want to build things. They want to build things that they can also recognize as having an effect in the real world. But it's not only technology that needs to be engineered, it's also user interfaces that need to be engineered. User interface design, if you start with that, you start with the human being involved, the data subject. So privacy engineering is much broader than just coding. It is about designing user experiences. You need to take those on board. And as Ari already mentioned, it's not only the technology, it is also about the language that is being used in these user interfaces, the way things are explained. So there's text writers, technical writers, not lawyers that write privacy policies, but manual writers that can create engaging language that makes sense to the audience. But it's also about engineering processes in your organization to properly deal. You know, you may want to have a privacy oversight board which vets ways in which data gets used. That needs to be engineered from a business perspective as well. So the topic is much broader than technology. And it's almost unfair to engineers, the technical engineers, to think that privacy engineering is about them producing privacy-friendly technology. It's not. It's about the entire topic. Having said that, engineers want to solve problems by being creative, which means you need to throw problems at them. You need to throw requirements at them, and it's up to the people that decide what gets done to properly come up with requirements. But requirements are not proposing solutions. Leave the engineers the freedom to come up with clever ways to solve the problem. So don't give them constraints, give them requirements, and then check whether it's there. So this is also an important thing for policymakers to consider. Don't write solutions into laws, write objectives and maybe requirements in law, but don't tell how. Because in that way, engineers will not have the freedom to come up with the best solutions. And I'm not talking about engineers of technology, I'm talking about the user interface engineers, I'm talking about the process engineers and what have you. So there's more to it than the technology. Thanks.
Thank you for this perspective. Jeff is a privacy engineer, so you know, what makes you tick, as Simon
My parents
put
are
it?
not trees.
And how do you see this question of the common language? Can you perhaps give us an example from practice, from some products you've seen or you've built that would work in both worlds?
Yes, I've spent my entire life designing, architecting, and deploying software systems. I thought I would draw on some work that I've been involved with. I'm going to give an example of a national scale database in the US for voter registration modernization that has privacy-preserving features, and how I believe it is or will be 100% repurposable for GDPR. But to set this up just real quickly, as I was living in Vegas, yes, the story starts in Vegas, building surveillance software for the casinos, and I'd never really even heard of the word privacy or privacy policy. If somebody would have said those words, I would have just looked at them dumbfounded. A few years later, the US government and others started using the software for counterterrorism, and I slowly started to wake up and started to get interested in privacy by design. And there was a defining moment where I was reading something in a newspaper, and I just went, oh, they're using it that way? And so I set out to start building privacy by design into these systems that I've been creating. And at one point, then IBM acquires my company. At one point, I invented a privacy-only product, but I found out nobody bought that. If you just built a privacy-only product, so I realized you had to just bake it into actual things everybody needs. And so I had to start over from scratch while I was at IBM, and we spent a year on paper just to try to get it right, thinking about privacy. This is 8 years ago, and we spent 2.5 years building it. And so now to fast forward, the setup there is with privacy baked in, one of the problems that we were trying to solve in the United States is our voter election rolls are messy. People move states, they're registered in both states, but they can't vote in both, so it makes the rolls questionable because you see people are registered. You have some places where there's more people registered than live there. And the goal was to allow the states to combine their data to figure out who's the same as who, so they could reach out to voters and say, did you move? And so what we did is we did this with Pew Charitable Trust, and it now runs 1/3 of the country. It's scalable. It's 250 million records. It's 100 million people, and the Democratic states and the Republican states both like it, and my friends in the privacy community that I spent a lot of time with have looked at it and went, that's just not so bad, which is great, you know, when you hear that. And what happens is before the states send the data to the central database, the features, the PII, the driver's license, the social, and the date of birth are anonymized irreversibly before they're sent. And so the database at the center is computing who's the same as who, and they're providing insights back to the states. And then the states make local decisions. So that was 5 years ago, and they have one person that runs the entire system, so it's just scalable and easy to use. And now fast forward with GDPR, here's why I think it's probably 100% repurposable, is there's the big missing link in GDPR is organizations are not going to actually be able to find the records about the data subject. They're going to forget to search all the databases. They're going to forget to search the payroll database to see that somebody was hired and then fired 3 years ago. It's going to be like going to a library with no card index and having to search all of the aisles of the library to look for the books that relate to the author who's the single subject. And so I believe the exact same thing that's used in voter registration is going to allow organizations complying with GDPR to have a single subject search, to be able to singularly go to one index and say, what do we know about Liz Reston, and find Beth Reston, Elizabeth Reston, Reston misspelled. And if I don't know how organizations are actually going to find all the data with all the typographical errors. So anyway, I think that that's going to be entirely repurposable for that problem.
It's excellent to hear about already, existing tools that solve problems in both worlds. I'm going to pick up one or two ideas that you've shared. So, for instance, Simon's idea that this is about a much broader thing than just engineering. So there's policy, there are legal requirements that need to be taken into account. And then I heard you, Jeff, talking about PII, personally identifiable information. Whereas here in Europe, we always refer to personal data. And then there are differences, and perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges for American companies to become GDPR compliant. So looking also at new policies, new guidelines from regulators, new legal obligations, is there something that brings these two concepts together? I'm actually thinking of asking Naomi about any new guidance from NIST, for instance, towards the concept of PII. Have there been changes there? Is there any tendency to broaden it, to cover more information, or there's what's happening there?
Well, so NIST uses the U.S. federal definition of PII, which is, any information that's identifying and that can be linked to, an individual. So, and when I recently explained that to a company that wanted to know if they were going to be aligned with our guidance, they said, "But that's everything." It's like, well, it is a risk-based assessment. So I appreciate that, there are various legal sectors in the U.S. and various definitions of PII that may be more or less limiting, but the guidance that we put out is focused on, a broad definition. It's any information that can be linked to an individual, and so that's what our guidance is oriented around.
That's excellent, because it helps, make the point that we can look at privacy engineering, bringing the two worlds together. Achim, do you want to add something?
Yeah. Actually, the words that Naomi just used, which are probably from the 1974 Federal Privacy Act, are all words which appear also still in the definition of personal data in the GDPR. There are more words in the GDPR, but I'm not going to elaborate on that at this moment. But on that end, I think on the recognition of the elements that should be considered, the starting point, not surprisingly, is not so far away, because the US privacy law was made in '74. The European privacy laws were also made in the first half or the second half of the 1970s, and there was a common thinking at the time, so we just have to maybe reactivate it. But why do we need it as a lingua franca? And maybe that's an element which I haven't made clearly yet, but the GDPR has a global impact, I said, and many of the services which we are used and the products are made in the US. And the engineers who design things in the US have to understand against what their products and services will be measured when they enter into the area where the GDPR is applied. And so there is a need, and that is also very well understood, as I can say, on the other side of the Atlantic, as some of the colleagues on the panel witness here. Thank you.
Carmela.
So I'm going to try to address 2 points that come from different sides. One is this about, is PII and the personal data, how do they relate? I essentially think it's the wrong question if we're talking about privacy engineering. That's again trying to depart from a law, bring it down to the engineering, then move it to the other side and see if it complies with the law. As a privacy engineer, of course we have to comply with the law, but the idea to me is not, oh, let's see what the law requires and then trying to implement it, but let's see what privacy is. How much private data can I not use in the system? How I can get away from actually having any of these problems? And then at the end, check if that's compliant. And if one does this exercise when thinking, it may come as a surprise, but most of the time you're so near from being compliant with both laws, much more than trying to depart from one and trying to translate to the other and then get lost in translation. And in that sense, I'm also going to try to address, and I really like your 2 points about engineering's. It's not only about privacy technologies. I'm sorry if I came out as we have solved the problem. We didn't. But we do have many technologies that allow these engineers to do things that they don't know how to. And I'm going to try to make an analogy with big data. So maybe 10 years ago, if you went to your engineer and say, now you're going to have to do searches on billions of data, they would say, are you crazy? My MySQL database cannot do this in an essential time. So until NoSQL databases were actually developed and mainstream, people couldn't do this big data. But so now we're ready to have some technologies that, of course, need to be known. And I believe there is a gap, and this is what I was speaking about, a gap between the academic world in privacy technologies and the privacy engineering, which is that we don't know well each other. Some things that we build are not enough or are not adaptable to what the engineers need, and we would be very, we're very happy in engaging in discussion with engineers about how can we modify our technologies to fit in your processes. But it is also I need to recognize that just saying it is too difficult just means maybe you don't know the tools. So we need to have a bit more of a discussion about these tools are there, how do we use them, how do we make our engineers, how do we make people from NIST when they give guidelines, how do we engage with your engineers to make them aware that actually it may not be that difficult because there are tools out there.
Yes, Simon, go ahead.
I think indeed we should not be fussed up too much about the technologies, but have the common objective. And to oversimplify, but still going to do it, the general objective is to know and minimize or right size the risks to the individuals involved. And then you can have all kinds of methodologies, and in these methodologies, language is used. But I can also flip it around. If we complain about having different terminology, the only thing we need to teach engineers is every time just ask, what do you mean? Because asking that question triggers the conversation, and then it goes back, so what do we want to achieve? What we want to achieve is known and managed risks to the privacy of the individual. You know, so I'm not worried about having not the same language, because it's not uncommon to have that elsewhere in engineering terminology as well. And auditors also have their own terminology. It is a matter of, in a team with multiple professions, to ask, what do you mean? Explain it to me. Okay, then by now in this project, this is how we will call it. That's not a problem. It's the problem of not having that discussion.
Well, I actually disagree.
Okay.
I disagree with part of that. I think that I agree that part of the problem is we're not having that discussion. And my research has clearly showed that in many companies that engineers are not going to people that do know the answer to that question of what do you want or what do you need. They're making privacy-related decisions on their own, ad hoc, with maybe asking about their team leader, who is also an engineer, about his, and they're almost all men, his idea about what they mean or what these requirements mean. So to the extent that I absolutely agree, and I think you're 100% right, that part of this conversation is not happening, and that's a big barrier. But I disagree with the idea that what we need to do is teach engineers to ask, what do you mean? Because if it's that simple, of just having conversations with certain people, that ignores several issues that remain as barriers to the integration of privacy into design. One is, well, who are they asking? Are they asking a lawyer? Are they asking another engineer? Are they asking a policy person? Are they asking someone who's expert at their company at standards? So it matters who you're having a conversation with. If this entire conversation is among engineers only, then you're going to get a particular, almost Silicon Valley-ish response, and that's not always a good thing. Another thing that matters is the company that they're working in prioritizing privacy enough such that even if they get an answer that we want to avoid these kind of problems that users are facing with respect to privacy and their technology, even if they get this answer, is the company, are they working in a context of a company that cares enough to actually say, well, I'm going to we're going to stop this project because it's not working for us, or the privacy part isn't working for us. Because if a company will never say, or will never give an ear, if the CEO will never give an ear to the CPO, or will never care about privacy over, say, a traditional understanding of profit maximization by use of data, then it doesn't matter who they're talking to. It doesn't matter if they're talking to a lawyer or a privacy engineer who cares about privacy. And then the third problem is that in addition to not having the conversation and the question of who they talk to, the third thing is, well, what do we mean about integrating privacy into design. And I think this is closest to what you were getting at, is what do you mean, or what did you want by this? And there are, when you talk to engineers, even when you talk to CPOs and when you talk to lawyers, there are any number of definitions of what they mean, anything from coding something in to saying, well, at least I just want you to talk about it, or at least have it become part of the process, or at least I want some policy handed down by the CPO. And when there is so much latitude brought on by whether it's regulation that is either too vague, privacy by design and by default, no one really knows what that is, or no regulation because all regulators have given down are just guidelines, as you suggest, then it results in people saying, especially engineers saying, well, it's so vague that I don't know actually what to do in practice. So I think there's many more questions to ask than just having conversations. It's also about the social context and the legal context in which those questions are being asked.
Yeah, both Naomi and Achim want to, so Achim, Naomi, and then Jeff, how do you make these decisions?
Well, I'm very interested to hear what how Jeff is responding to this from a practical perspective. But what I wanted to say is I agree with Ari with a problem description. That in particular, I mentioned that earlier, that engineers, when they're left by themselves, they invent what they understand from privacy, and that's a point which, of course, is not guaranteed to come to the best solutions. I mean, that is one of the things that we also saw in our IPEN initiative, where we bring engineers and other privacy experts together. That this is a very fruitful exchange and worth doing by itself. But I wouldn't say that as far as the methodology is concerned, we are as far back as Ari said. I mean, I leave it to Naomi to explain how much advance they have made in their initiatives. And there's other research projects like those from our colleagues in Leuven who have actually developed engineering models on how to privacy by design objectives, so that you can actually measure what your tool does against technically defined directives. So it's actually the process of developing privacy engineering is actually answering all these questions, and we have made more progress than is widely known. But disseminating this is certainly something which is needed. Thank you.
Naomi.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up from there. Thanks for the segue. So we had observed a number of these problems. We do grants to pilots, and a lot of them were in this identity federation solutions, and they had to show alignment with privacy, and they couldn't do it. So they would say, well, we provide consent, so we've managed privacy. And meanwhile, their whole infrastructure was tracking and profiling people. So, and so we couldn't even agree on the risks, like what the risk was. And so we'd have these long conversations. And so when we actually developed a tool, a privacy risk assessment methodology, which was literally a set of worksheets, and walked them through our privacy risk model to analyze how they were processing information and what the likelihood and impact if they created problems for individuals. They actually had a tool to have a real conversation, and one that they could actually take all the way up into their principles. And once that happened, then security was over there telling the story of, hey, there's this threat, and we've got this vulnerability, and it's all very concrete. And up until then, privacy had been sort of saying, well, privacy is important, but now privacy could tell a story that said, hey, this data action where we're processing this information could create a problem, or we've surveyed our constituents or whatever, and they're concerned about this. And so actual decisions could be made about how to address that. And and sometimes the answer is we're going to accept the risk, but other times they could figure out a way to mitigate the risk. And the one thing that didn't happen was that projects stopped. right? There was always a solution, right? Because risk management isn't about getting to zero risk. It's about getting to an acceptable level of residual risk. And, you know, so I've been, you know, we're working with the Department of Transportation on some connected vehicle pilots for some cities in the US, and we went in to sort of explain our privacy risk assessment methodology, and they said, well, whoa, you know, like, well, let's not have too much privacy. It's like, what? And so, like, the idea being that, you know, we were going to come in and, like, stop this pilot. And we said, no, actually, when you codify, when you go through this process, you codify it, you actually begin to realize that you can actually make responses, and you don't have to have perfection, but you can actually do better.
Thank you. Jeff, so how do you make this? How do you make these decisions?
I'll start here. There's an element in GDPR that I don't think can be implemented without very clever privacy by design thinking. And that element is the right to erasure. The idea of erasing some data and then remembering to keep it erased is going to be a problem. And I'm going to give you an example, and this is in the privacy by design thinking that I do, I look to, because I'm a practitioner, I go look for examples that I've seen across these 100 systems and figure out how to move them forward and reapply them. So I'm going to give you another example. I'll pick one, this case back out of Las Vegas, is I will argue they maybe had the first really great right to erasure implementation with big teeth in it, with fines, and here's how this goes. In Las Vegas, there's a practice called responsible gaming, and there's phone numbers on the walls of the casinos that say if you have a gambling problem, call this number. You call the number, and you can put yourself on a self-exclusionary list. You're putting yourself on a watch list. By the way, this is the only watch list I know of that you can put yourself on but can't take yourself off. You know, because you have a couple of beers on a Friday night, and you're thinking, no, I'm going to be lucky tonight. So you can't get yourself off. So the casino is obligated to not be able to see them anymore. But what happens is the casino inadvertently, because new marketing lists show up or there was a spelling in another database that they didn't quite catch, they'll market to that person and tell them, come in for a free buffet and 2 free room nights, and tease them back in. They will come back in, they lose their money, they go to casino credit, it's a little bank, they borrow a lot of money, and they lose all of that. They lose their house. This has happened more than once. And then they go back to the casino, and they say, they sue the casino, and they win hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is very interesting. And what's going to happen now, and why this is going to be so critical, I think, around privacy design features built in here, is you have to be able to remember to forget. And how will we do that? How will that be done? And how do you monitor that continuously? Because the data will sneak back in. You'll have stamped it out once, and it's just gonna, I've seen this, it's just gonna reemerge over here. And will they remember to keep forgetting? And how that gets done, I think, is gonna take some clever privacy by design engineering.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to run out the conversation off the rails, but are you suggesting that the company is completely innocent in that?
No, the company has a complete obligation to forget.
No, the casino is completely innocent there?
No.
Oh, okay. Because you said
no.
You suggest.
I'm glad we clarified this.
You suggested it was an accident, like some name was misspelled or something.
Yeah, they didn't mean to, but it's a problem. That shouldn't happen. If somebody says, "Please stop marketing to me," a casino should go to extraordinary lengths to not continue to tease that person back.
Right. Okay.
Oh yeah.
I thought you were suggesting that it was the mistake and they were just they were.
Hey, had you asked me before I knew what the word privacy meant, I don't know what I would have said. But I'm a student of privacy now.
Simon, and then.
Just wanted to reflect a bit on what Ali just said. Engineering is broader than just the technology. It is also about indeed getting the right engineers, right education, all of that. To me, that's part of the methodology to be used, which involves more people than engineering to produce a product. So that's a key element. And actually, while thinking about it, we may not need privacy engineering. We need engineering for privacy. And that's quite a different concept, because privacy engineering suggests that it's a separate activity, with its own track, whereas engineering for privacy ensures that everyone involved in generating, producing the end result needs to take it as one of the non-functional requirements into perspective. So maybe we should stop talking about privacy engineering, but start talking about engineering for privacy.
Can I just add like a 2-second thing to that? Just really 2 seconds. Is in IBM, I worked with the chief privacy officer, Christina Peters, and we ran a wiki site, and we were really active in bringing engineers forward because they just generally don't know. And we did storytelling. We would give them examples of systems that had failures to get them thinking about it. And I probably was leading the privacy work in IBM's engineering community as an IBM fellow. Yeah.
And one of the things that we also find is that when talking to engineers who often are assigned in teams to work on a specific part of a larger ecosystem of a technology, often the response is when you ask them, well, how do you integrate things like confidentiality or user needs or something? And when they say, well, that's not my mandate, someone else is doing that. And I think Simon is 100% right when he says that, if we talk about privacy engineering, it makes it so much easier for someone to say, well, that's someone else's job. But if we truly believe in some comprehensive definition of privacy by design, and we can talk about a better definition in this panel if we would like, but if we truly believe, then again, Simon is right. It's part of a larger ecosystem, and anything we do that allows someone or allows an engineer to say, that is someone else's job, that's a lawyer's job, that's a privacy engineer's job, that's my CPO's job, then it's not gonna come to fruition.
Carmela, would you want to add something to that?
No, I actually agree, and I think I always, when I say privacy engineering, I always think about engineering for privacy. How do we engineer privacy by design? That's the thing that we have been trying to articulate for a couple of years now. But I actually want to go back a bit to this erasure right, because I think that now here we're mixing again the discussion, because the erasure right, to me, it's kind of at the end of the engineering for privacy process. Once you have the data, you should have already done the engineering for privacy. And the right to erasure is a legal requirement. And that means that you don't have started from the privacy perspective, but from the perspective of the regulation, and ended up deciding that you need to delete this. But actually, if I was now training my engineers for privacy, that would be maybe one of the last lessons. Once we have this data, how we decide all of this. So I'm not very sure that that is really the discussion to be had. I actually think that shifts the focus from how did we get this data? Why did we get this data? Because if actually you wanted a blacklist or a whitelist, actually having a hash of the phone and never having the phone and never be able to run this email could actually be done. And then you wouldn't even need to delete it at some point.
Achim, you wanted to add something, and then we'll open the floor for questions. There's a microphone there. So.
Yeah. On 2 points, on the example that Jeff mentioned, and I would like to put that into context with the state of art. When I finished my university studies in the 80s, some of my colleagues university colleagues who were ending at the same time, entered into a big project for an insurance company to get a person identification for all the different databases that the same company had, where the same person was registered under different names, sometimes for family, sometimes for car insurance, sometimes for everything, and to find out this is all the same person. So that's state of the art to do this. So of course it's not always and everywhere available, all technology. So there we have an element, and as the privacy by design is defined as an element state of the art, promoting what is already possible is of course one part of it. The other comment is on Simon's remark that we should do engineering for privacy instead of privacy engineering. That is the objective. The engineer is always challenged with competing objectives, which cannot be all achieved at the same time. The solution shall be cheap, it shall be fast, it shall be user-friendly, and it shall be totally secure. And none of these objectives can be developed in an absolute way. And another objective that should be added, like the 3 dimensions of efficiency and security plus privacy, should be one of the objectives which is taken into account in every project where it is relevant. That is the final objective, engineering privacy as any other of the objective, and not keeping it separate, definitely not. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question, Peter.
Thank you. Hi, is this on? Director. Peter Swire, I'm at Georgia Tech. I'm also a fellow of the Future Privacy Forum with Gabriela. So first, a comment, the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, is starting a section on privacy engineering that's going to be rolled out at their March summit in DC. I think Naomi is part of that, and others. So there's definitely, within the professional community, a new institutional energy behind the area. The second thing, until Achim just mentioned security, I don't think anybody mentioned cybersecurity in the whole panel. And in my experience, a lot of times the people working on cybersecurity and data and systems overlap with the people who have privacy responsibilities. And I found that sort of an interesting split. At least maybe the cybersecurity has gotten more emphasis on the American side than on the European side in terms of where that happens. And I've heard that there may be questions under the GDPR about IP logs for your website and whether that's personal data so that you can't retain it without consent. And so I'm curious, as an example of how to think about security and privacy together, maybe from the Europeans, what's your understanding of how these cybersecurity tools of using logs for forensics fits with privacy concerns about the IP data?
So Carmela and then Simon, or the other way around. Simon?
There is no change in this respect with the existing directive. These logs are part of processing data for a purpose, which is security, detection of fraud, abuse, forensics, and there is a legitimate interest to have that, provided you manage to do the balancing test, which means that retaining log files eternally will be problematic. But 90 days should never be a problem. So so there is also the misconception that everything needs to be done on consent. Actually, consent should be the exceptional case. It should be based on contract or legitimate interest and the other stuff.
And is 90 days enough to do forensics on a data
maybe
breach?
If the answer is no, then you can demonstrate that you need more. You could also, if 90 days is not enough because at day 60 you have an incident, then you can temporarily, yeah. So and this is known territory, particularly in Germany.
Just quickly, from a data protection regulator perspective, the standards are necessity and proportionality. Just keeping everything that you ever get from anyone because it might come handy in 10 years is definitely out of scope. But 90 days, 60 days, half a year, I mean, we have a similar problem with keeping backups where we also don't want to have each backup deleted immediately when the operational data is gone. But I mean, if you have a backup cycle by which everything disappears in 6 weeks or so, no one will break your neck on this.
Thank you.
We have another question. Please, sir.
Hi. Is it on? Okay. Hi. Woody Hartzog with Northeastern University. I really enjoyed this panel, and I wanted to ask a theoretical question for a second about privacy and design as a way of also teasing the next panel on privacy by design, which is coming up this afternoon, which I'm on. So it occurs to me that as we talk about privacy engineering and privacy by design, that we've really backed into this thing, meaning we came to the realization late that the most important thing about privacy, or one of the most important things about privacy, is actually starting from the very beginning and building things that are privacy protective rather than addressing it after the fact, right? So in other words, if you hear about the ways in which we conceptualize privacy by design, it's almost reactionary, which is, of course, that's where we are right now. So the question I have then is that we're talking about this as though it's something separate from the rest of our data protection plan. Right, so the GDPR has all these other things, and also privacy and design. Is the goal, and this is what I'd love for anyone to speculate on the panel, is the goal eventually to merge design and processing obligations protection so that it's all just privacy protection? Or do you think that there's value in continuing to conceptually make things like privacy by design and privacy engineering a distinct category from other processing obligations? And that may be a little theoretical, but any speculation on that would be.
Yeah. Carmela wants to pick it up. And
so
then
from a
Achim.
technical perspective, and also addressing the question before, privacy is a security property. This idea that we are separating them is, I'm sorry that came across, but privacy is a security property. Security engineers think about privacy engineers think about security, and you need to have both. And regarding is this separate from other data processing and data protection? To me, the process of engineering for privacy, I'm going to change my vocabulary from next one, is something that actually minimizes the number of data that is collected, minimizes the trust. And then after you have gone through that process, decided how much data you have to collect, then for that data, because some data is impossible, we just cannot live without. In the case from a census, for instance, you actually need to collect the address of people. We cannot have a census without actually the census itself. And in that case, then you go for the data protection. So I don't think that these are separate. These are just complementary and a different way of thinking about the process, which puts privacy first instead of data plan first.
Achim?
Well, it's was already, I mean, we use the term privacy engineering now to raise the attention for the need to take privacy into account in the engineering process. We follow the model that the people who became aware of IT security used like 20 years ago, when security by design was a big thing, because security wasn't taken into account when designing new products. Now that has changed in some areas, we're not there yet. And so we're racing up to make privacy catch up with security in this process, so that both these non-functional objectives are part of every engineering decision. Let me add a commercial block. We invite you all to join us tomorrow night after the first reception to a side event in the Grand Hall, where we discuss privacy by design with 2 regulators and 2 business representatives in a broader perspective. End of commercial.
Jeff wanted to add something?
I'm going to give you a quick example of something that I think doesn't fall under security, but I personally think about it under the banner of privacy by design. If you find yourself on a watch list and you realize you shouldn't be on it, and then you go through a process to get yourself removed from it, how long do you think it should take before that watch list record is removed from all the downstream places? So there's real engineering work that says the moment somebody gets taken off of a watch list, you should, in a split second, not have to wait till the end of the month or the end of the quarter for a big batch reload. You should be able to instantly stop harming that person. Mm-hmm. And to do that takes serious engineering work to be transactional, because then it reduces harm.
Thank you, Simon, and then the following question.
Just one thought to throw out for others to try out as well. So when we build a new product, we always start with a product brief. What I've now asked to be added to the product brief is the first rough draft of the GDPR compliant privacy statement. It works wonders in terms of creating focus on what are we actually going to do. So to us, I've done this in a few instances, and it starts to help shape the thoughts regarding the product itself, the benefits, and what do I need for that. And then all of a sudden, engineering for privacy becomes requirements gathering, rather than at the end writing up a fluffy privacy policy that is intended for no one to be understandable.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much.
The next question.
Valentin Gibelot, I'm a legal researcher in the European project TrueSec on ICT certification. And I wondered if the panel believed that privacy engineering should be encouraged as a specialty, or if every engineer in the ICT domain should ideally strive to become a privacy engineer. And my question is not directed at anyone.
Naomi, maybe you would like to?
Sure. So I think there's already been a pretty interesting conversation about, privacy engineering for privacy. I do think that, all engineers need to have some understanding, but, people are going to specialize in certain techniques, and so, when we go through our privacy risk assessment methodology, engineers begin to say automatically, they begin to say, oh, hey, I'm doing something over here with this information. Is that going to be a problem? So they don't necessarily have the background to be able to, understand what a problem is, how, individuals perceive, or what their privacy interests are. But they once they understand the construct, they can begin to raise issues. And so I think certainly all engineers, should be able to do that. But I do think, just as there are security engineers who bring a little bit more knowledge and sort of background, that there will probably always be a place. And as Achim said, there are trade-offs that have to be made, and so you can't really have one engineer sort of making all those trade-offs. It has to be a discussion in the organization, and there have to be advocates. So, I've seen circumstances where engineers think that they should do all of the risk management, and that's a little like the fox watching the hen house. So,
just taking it from a practical example, I mentioned the security coming into the engineering process, and I'll take the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, as a model. So everybody preparing an RFC for a new protocol or a new service knows that there may be issues about security, and that needs to be taken into account, and they should know that there's also issues on privacy. And so the IETF is working on having every product being considered by those proposing it, but they also have special teams who look at the security features and at the privacy features in the course of the process. And we've heard examples from companies in our event that we organize which doing basically the same thing. Everybody knows they need to think about it, but there are specialists who actually know how to do things and have solutions for common problems easily to implement, more than everybody being a specialist of everything.
Jeff?
I think there's way too many engineers out there that do not have any notion of what privacy is, and I think that it's beneficial if almost all of them find out more about it. And one of the easiest ways to do that, I have found, again, running this group in IBM, it was the Responsible Innovation Wiki that I mentioned earlier, is storytelling. And I'll just give you one example. This would be the way I would storytell to engineers. I would say in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are 4 articles that use the word arbitrary. One of those articles says, thou shalt not arbitrarily arrest, detain, torture, hoods, masks, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. And then I tell them a story. I tell them there was a time early after 9/11, I found a government organization in the US that had some watch lists, and one of their watch lists, they didn't know who told them to watch for them. It had no information about attribution. They had no idea if the person was still on the watch list or not, or why they were on the watch list. How could you possibly not violate that human right under arbitrary? Because you don't even know where it came from. So then I used that to teach this notion of full attribution, where it's essential that every record knows from where it came. And when you storytell like that, it gets engineers, baking things in because it makes sense.
Thank you. Ari, you wanted to add something?
You're absolutely right that we're not teaching engineers, or we need to teach all engineers at least something about privacy, whether it's enough to raise issues during the design phase or appreciate it in more detail. The thing is, we're not. It's one thing for someone to do it in an organization or in a company, but the computer science, electrical engineering, computer engineering programs that they go through need to do that. And if you look at, as part of my research, if you look at the course catalogs for top 10 electrical engineering programs and computer science programs in the United States, the word security comes up. Systems operations classes have classes on security. Word privacy comes up a whole lot more rarely. There are no classes, there are few classes that are specifically focused on. What schools do now is they have these secondary ethics and engineering programs where you're required to take like a core course or a liberal arts course or something, and they give you options. And one student told me during these interviews, it said, well, my school gives students 36 different options to take as their ethics requirement for their engineers. So a lot of my friends took a class on swing music, which is awesome. I mean, that's fantastic, but it's not teaching them anything about ethics. It's not teaching them anything about privacy. I mean, Peter Swire is right here, not to point him out, not to put him on the spot here, but Georgia Tech would be a perfect example, one of the top engineering programs in the country, and sitting right next door is one of the greatest privacy minds in the country. And why isn't Peter's privacy class mandatory for engineers or computer scientists at Georgia Tech? If there were, then your job would be a lot easier. The company's job at training engineers to spot these issues would be a lot easier, not because Peter's a good teacher, he is, but because at least this would be part of the governing structure, the governing context of what, all right, this is part of my portfolio, and it's not right now.
Then just...
Thank you.
Just
No, it was complimentary. It wasn't a...
It's not entirely accurate, though. I mean, the good teacher part's wrong. No, it's now an ethics, way to satisfy ethics for all undergraduate engineers, and that's increased enrollment a lot because it gives them a way to meet requirements.
Great. Yeah.
So
Yes,
Simon, to
one
conclude,
last,
and then...
from the European perspective, we have a lot of engineers in the eastern part of Germany and Poland. I have to do a totally different way of teaching privacy. I need to teach them how to violate privacy in an appropriate way, because they have reminiscence of adverse regimes and they are inclined to do nothing with data because they might end up in a different situation. So yes, there's also another reason to teach privacy and how to do in a responsible way, use the data that we have. Totally different viewpoint.
Thank you very much for that remark. Very good last remark. We won't have time to make concluding remarks. Lunch is already being served. This was an excellent discussion. Thank you so much, all of you, for being part of this panel. I'm very happy we were here today talking about privacy engineering. And thank you very much for attending.